Imagine this: a shadowy courtroom, a judge with a secret so dark it could ruin him, and a young lawyer, barely able to walk, standing alone against a system rigged to crush him. They laughed in his face, called him a fool, but what they didn't, no, he'd been hiding a weapon sharper than any gavel, a secret buried in a dusty attic, waiting to explode their lies wide open. This isn't just a trial, it's a takedown no one saw coming. How does a kid they mocked bring down a king? Stick around because the truth is wilder than you think. So, where are you watching from today? Chicago, where this courtroom drama unfolded, or somewhere across the globe? Drop a comment and let me know what you think of Jamal's fight. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button. Every day, we're unearthing stories of justice like this one, and I'd hate for you to miss the next twist. Let's keep this journey going together. The air in the Chicago courtroom hung heavy, thick with the stale scent of polished oak and decades of whispered verdicts. Jamal Carter felt it press against his chest as he stepped forward, the metallic click-click of his crutches echoing off the hardwood floor. Every eye in the room turned to him, some with pity, most with disdain. At 28, he was young for a lawyer, younger still for one daring to face the Cook County Circuit Court alone. His lean frame, draped in a slightly wrinkled suit, his mother had ironed the night before, leaned slightly to the right, a permanent reminder of the car crash that had shattered his legs 18 years ago. But it wasn't his body that drew the stares today. It was the audacity of his presence. Across the room, Elizabeth Monroe stood like a marble statue carved from confidence, her platinum hair swept into a tight bun, her tailored navy suit screaming, 30 years of courtroom victories. She smirked as Jamal adjusted his crutches against the defendant's table, her sharp green eyes flicking to her legal team, 3 junior attorneys who mirrored her amusement. "Your Honor?" she began, her voice smooth as silk but edged with mockery. "I hope we're not wasting the court's time with this novice. I'm not sure he's even read the full case file." A ripple of chuckles spread through her side of the gallery, soft but deliberate, like the opening notes of a Predator's song. Judge Harold Grayson didn't laugh, but the faint curl of his lip betrayed his thoughts. A towering figure with salt and pepper hair and a voice that could shake the rafters, he sat behind the bench like a king surveying a peasant revolt. He adjusted his glasses, peering down at Jamal over the rims. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone clipped, "I trust you're prepared to justify your presence here? This isn't a law school moot court." The words landed like a gavel, heavy and final, and a murmur of agreement hummed through the courtroom. The jury, 12 faces ranging from bored to skeptical, shifted in their seats, already half convinced this would be a slaughter. Jamal didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. Growing up on the South Side, he'd been the kid left behind on cracked sidewalks while others raced to the basketball courts, the one teachers pitied, but never pushed. "Poor Jamal," they'd whisper, as if his crutches defined him. But his mother's voice rang louder in his memory than any of them. "You don't need legs to stand tall, baby. You need a mind that won't bend." And his father, Henry Carter, a tax auditor who'd spent decades chasing numbers through the IRS, had given him that mind, night after night, at their chipped kitchen table, teaching him to spot the lies hidden in ledgers. Today, he was here. For Marcus Evans, a wiry black man in his 40s sitting beside him, accused of tax fraud that could land him 10 years in Joliet. Marcus owned a small auto shop, barely scraping by, until the IRS claimed he'd hidden $200,000 in unreported income, a charge as absurd as it was damning. Jamal knew Marcus was innocent. He'd seen the desperation in the man's eyes, the way his hands trembled when he handed over his books. But proving it meant facing Monroe and Grayson, a duo who'd turned this courtroom into their personal fiefdom. Monroe strode to the center of the room, her heels clicking with authority. "Your Honor, the evidence is irrefutable," she said, dropping a thick stack of tax documents onto the prosecution table with a theatrical thud. Mr. Evans falsified returns, evaded taxes, and buried the profits in shell accounts. We have IRS filings, bank records, and signed affidavits from 2 auditors. The defense— She cast a sidelong glance at Jamal, her lips twitching. "Has nothing but excuses." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, then added, "If Mr. Carter thinks he can spin this into a sob story, well, he's in over his head." Grayson leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Mr. Carter, I assume you have a response?" His voice carried a faint warning, as if he'd already decided the outcome. The gallery, a mix of reporters, court regulars, and, Marcus's family leaned in expecting Jamal to stumble. A juror in the back row, a middle-aged man with a notepad, scribbled something, his expression unreadable but oddly intent. Jamal adjusted his stance, his crutches steady against the table's edge. He met Grayson's gaze, then Monroe's, his brown eyes calm but burning. "Your Honor," he said, his voice low and even. "The prosecution's case rests on documents they claim are airtight, but I'd like to start with something simple." He reached into his battered briefcase, a hand-me-down from his father, and pulled out a single sheet, holding it up. "This is one of their IRS filings. Notice the seal at the bottom." Monroe rolled her eyes. "Really, Your Honor? We're debating typography now. This is a waste of time." But Jamal pressed on, unfazed. "It's not typography, Ms. Monroe. It's protocol. The IRS seal on this document uses a format discontinued in 2015, 3 years before the alleged fraud. My father worked at the IRS for 22 years. He taught me every detail of their standards. This seal doesn't match." He placed the paper on the table, letting the implication hang in the air. A hush fell over the courtroom. Grayson's brow furrowed, just slightly, and he reached for his gavel but didn't strike it. Monroe's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered, crossing her arms. "A clerical error at best," she snapped. "It proves nothing." "Maybe," Jamal said, his voice steady as steel. "But if one document's wrong, what else is?" "I move to compel discovery of the original IRS records, Your Honor. Let's see if the prosecution's house of cards holds up." Grayson exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping the bench. "Motion denied," he said, his tone curt. "We're not chasing shadows here, Mr. Carter. Stick to the case at hand." The denial stung, but Jamal caught the flicker of unease in Monroe's eyes, a crack in her armor. The juror with the notepad scribbled faster, his gaze darting between Jamal and the judge. As Monroe launched into her next argument, detailing Marcus's supposed shell accounts, Jamal sat back, his mind racing. He'd planted the seed. The seal was no accident. He'd seen it before, late nights poring over his father's old manuals, the ones Henry kept in a locked drawer with a note, "For when the system fails." Jamal didn't know who'd faked it or why, not yet, but he knew this. Grayson and Monroe thought they'd buried him before he'd even started. They were wrong. Outside, in the gallery, I clutched my purse tighter, my knuckles whitening. I'd watched my boy fight his whole life, through the pain of rehab, the stares at school, the nights he studied until dawn with those crutches propped beside him. Today, they saw a cripple. I saw a warrior. And I knew, as sure as the sun would rise, that Jamal Carter was just getting started. The courtroom's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like a swarm of angry wasps, casting a sickly glow across Jamal Carter's face as he slumped into the cracked vinyl chair of his tiny South Side apartment. The echo of Judge Grayson's dismissal, "Motion denied," still rang in his ears, sharp and cold as a blade. He'd lost the first round and he knew it. The jury's eyes had glazed over during Monroe's parade of bank records. Marcus Evans had gripped his arm afterward, whispering, "They're gonna lock me up, Jamal. I can feel it." And then there was the letter, slipped under his door an hour ago from the Chicago Bar Association. Complaint received regarding professional conduct. Respond within 14 days. Grayson's fingerprints were all over it, a warning shot to scare him off the case. Jamal tossed the letter onto the cluttered coffee table, next to a stack of law books and a half-empty mug of cold coffee. His crutches leaned against the wall, their aluminum frames scratched and dented from years of use. He rubbed his temples, the ache in his legs flaring up, a phantom reminder of that rainy night 18 years ago when a drunk driver had plowed into his family's sedan. He'd been 10, strapped in the back seat, laughing at his dad's bad jokes about tax season. Then came the headlights, the screech of tires, the world spinning into darkness. He'd woken up in a hospital bed, his legs mangled, his parents' voices gone forever. The doctors had said he'd never walk again. His mother had said otherwise. I remember those nights after the crash, sitting by his bedside in that sterile room, watching him fight through the pain. He was just a boy, but he had a fire in him, a quiet, stubborn thing that refused to flicker out. When the other kids ran laps at school, he'd sit on the sidelines, nose buried in one of Henry's old IRS manuals. "Why do you read that stuff?" I'd ask, and he'd grin, his gap-toothed smile lighting up the gloom. "Because Dad said numbers don't lie, Mama. People do." Henry had been a tax auditor for 22 years, a man who could sniff out fraud like a bloodhound on a scent. He'd sit Jamal on his knee at that chipped kitchen table, pointing at columns of figures. "See this, son? Someone's hiding something. Find the mismatch and you've got him." Now Jamal stared at the ceiling, the memory of his father's voice pulling him back to the courtroom. That mismatched IRS seal wasn't a fluke. It was a grain of sand in the machine, a tiny flaw that could grind the whole thing to a halt. Monroe's documents were too perfect, too polished, like a rehearsed lie. He'd seen it before, in the ECs, mock trials he'd run in his head as a teenager, lying awake while his peers dreamed of touchdowns and prom dates. While they chased girls, he chased justice, poring over case law in the dim light of the Chicago Public Library's basement, his crutches propped against the table. He grabbed the prosecution's tax filing from his briefcase, the one with the faulty seal, and held it up to the flickering lamp. The IRS had updated its seal format in 2015. Henry had drilled that into him after a big overhaul at the agency. This document, dated 2018, bore the old design, a circular emblem with a faded eagle, missing the modern digital watermark. It was subtle, the kind of detail most lawyers would shrug off as a clerical glitch. But Jamal wasn't most lawyers. He was Henry Carter's son. The courtroom came back to him in flashes. Monroe's smirk, Grayson's curt dismissal, the jury's indifference. One face stood out, a juror in the back row, a wiry man in his 50s with a notepad, scribbling furiously during Jamal's argument about the seal. The others had doodled or stared into space, but this guy. He'd watched Jamal like a hawk, his pen moving with purpose. Jamal frowned. Something about it nagged at him, but he couldn't place it. Not yet. A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the clock, 9:47 p.m., too late for visitors. He hobbled over, peering through the peephole. A shadow shifted in the hallway, tall and broad, then vanished. When he cracked the door, the hall was empty, but a folded note lay on the grimy carpet. "Drop the case, Carter. You're out of your depth." The handwriting was jagged, urgent, like it had been scratched out in a hurry. His pulse quickened. This wasn't Grayson's style. Too crude, too direct. Monroe, maybe? Or someone higher? He locked the door, double-checked the deadbolt, and sank back into his chair. The note wasn't a surprise. He'd rattled them today, even if Grayson had shut him down. That denied motion wasn't the end. It was the beginning. He needed the original IRS records, not the polished copies Monroe had waved around. But getting them meant discovery, and Grayson had already slammed that door shut. Unless Jamal's gaze drifted to the Bar Association letter. A complaint this fast, this vague, stank of a setup. Grayson had pull. Decades on the bench, buddies in high places. Jamal had seen it before, reading transcripts of crooked judges burying young lawyers under bureaucracy. But he wasn't just any lawyer. He was the kid who'd memorized Miranda versus Arizona at 14, while his classmates traded Pokemon cards. He was the boy who'd limped into law school on a scholarship, graduating top of his class while working nights at a diner. He was Henry's legacy. He grabbed his phone and dialed Marcus. The man picked up on the second ring, his voice tight with worry. "Jamal, you see that letter? They're coming for you now, man. I told you this was too big." "They're scared, Marcus," Jamal said, his tone steady. "That seal's wrong. I don't know who faked it or why, but it's a crack in their wall. I'm not dropping this." A pause, then a shaky breath. "You sure you can win this?" Grayson's got the whole damn system behind him. Jamal glanced at the crutches, then at the note on the table. Dad used to say the system's only as strong as its weakest lie. We're gonna find it. Marcus chuckled, a faint spark of hope breaking through. You're something else, man. Just watch your back, all right? Always do, Jamal said, hanging up. He leaned back, the ache in his legs fading as his mind sharpened. Grayson and Monroe thought they'd cornered him, a crippled kid from the wrong side of town, too green to fight back. They didn't know he'd been fighting his whole life. I watched him from the kitchen doorway that night, his silhouette hunched over those papers. My boy, my warrior. They thought they could break him with a letter, a threat, a slammed gavel. They didn't know Jamal Carter didn't bend. Not then, not now. And as he scribbled notes under that dim lamp, I saw Henry in him. The same fire, the same refusal to let the liars win. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reckoning. Jamal Carter's apartment shrank around him as the clock ticked past midnight, the walls pressing in with every creak of the old building. The single bulb above his coffee table flickered, casting jagged shadows across the sprawl of papers. Tax, filings, IRS manuals, and that crumpled note. Drop the case, Carter. You're out of your depth. A faint thud echoed from the hallway, too deliberate to be the wind, and his pulse spiked. Someone was out there watching. The evening news had buzzed with a cryptic report. Young lawyer targeted after challenging Cook County judge. A veiled nod to him, and it sent a chill down his spine. His laptop hummed faintly, an old relic from his father's days at Howe. The agency, its screen glowing with a scanned copy of Monroe's faulty IRS document. The mismatched seal stared back at him, a silent taunt. He rubbed his eyes, the ache in his legs a dull roar now. But sleep wasn't an option, not when Marcus Evans was counting on him. Not when Grayson and Monroe thought they'd already won. He leaned closer to the screen, tracing the seal's faded eagle with his finger. Henry Carter had drilled it into him years ago, sitting at that chipped kitchen table on the south side. The IRS updated their seals in 15. Jamal, he'd said, tapping a manual with a calloused finger. New watermark, new font, digital security. If you see the old one on anything recent, someone's playing games. Jamal had been 12 then, his crutches propped against the chair, soaking up every word while his classmates traded comic books. Henry hadn't just taught him numbers, he'd taught him how to spot a lie before it could bury you. The memory steadied him now, cutting through the fog of exhaustion. He flipped open one of his father's old manuals, IRS Protocols 2014 edition, and cross-checked the seal. There it was. The pre-2015 design, no watermark, no microtext. Monroe's document, time-stamped 2018, was a fraud. But why? Tax evasion. Cases were common as dirt in Cook County. Why fake evidence to nail a small-time mechanic like Marcus? Jamal's gut twisted. This wasn't about Marcus. It was bigger. And that thud outside, that note, meant someone knew he was getting close. A sharp buzz jolted him upright, his phone vibrating on the table. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered, keeping his voice low. Yeah. Carter. A raspy voice hissed, distorted like it was run through a filter. You're digging where you shouldn't. Back off or you won't walk away, crutches or not. The line went dead before he could respond. His heart thudded against his ribs, but he forced a slow breath. Threats weren't new. He'd gotten them in law school, anonymous calls from rich kids who hated seeing a charity case outscore them. But this felt different. Personal. Desperate. He glanced at the door again, the deadbolt trembling under his stare. It wouldn't stop someone. Determined, but fear wasn't his master. He needed answers. The original IRS records could blow this wide open. But Grayson's denial of his discovery motion had tied his hands. He needed a back door, someone who'd seen the underbelly of Monroe's operation. Jamal scrolled through, his contacts landing on a name he hadn't called in years, Tommy Ruiz. They'd met in law school. Tommy, a wiry Puerto Rican kid with a knack for tech, had dropped out after a semester to work IT at a downtown firm. Rumor was he'd been fired from Monroe's office 6 months ago for insubordination. If anyone knew dirt, it was him. Jamal texted, "Need to talk, off the books, midnight, Rusty's Diner." The reply came fast. "You owe me a coffee, see you." Rusty's Diner sat on a crumbling corner of 63rd Street, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the damp night air. Jamal slid into a booth near the back, crutches tucked beside him, the smell of burnt grease and stale fries clinging to the air. Tommy arrived 10 minutes later, his hoodie pulled low, dark circles under his eyes. He dropped into the seat across from Jamal, smirking. "You look like hell, man. What's this about?" "Monroe," Jamal said, sliding the tax document across the table. "This seal's fake. I need to know what she's hiding." Tommy's smirk vanished as he scanned the page, his jaw tightening. "You're kicking a hornet's nest, Carter. I ran IT for Monroe 2 years, caught her red-handed. She axed me when I wouldn't wipe her dirty laundry, emails that'd make your skin crawl." "What kind?" Jamal pressed, leaning in, voice low. Tommy's eyes flicked to the diner's grimy windows, then back. "Grayson's orders. Barry. Cases, shift cash to offshore accounts. She's got a machine. Forged docs, bribes. Fired me 'cause I wouldn't play ball. She ruined my career, Jamal. Blacklisted me from every firm in town. I kept a backup drive. My insurance. If you're gunning for her, I'm rooting for you. I'll dig up more from my drive, send you anything useful." Jamal's pulse raced. "I need that drive, Tommy. And a witness." Tommy rubbed his jaw, then nodded. "Sarah Jennings, ex-IRS clerk. She processed their filth. Quit when they squeezed her too hard. Lives out in Humboldt Park now. Keeps a low profile. Watch your back, though. They don't mess around." He scribbled an address on a napkin and slid it over, then slipped out, his hoodie blending into the night. Back in the apartment, Jamal stared at the napkin. 1427 N Humboldt Ave, a lifeline in the dark. But that thud from earlier, the call, the note, it all pointed to Grayson. His father had known. Those locked drawers weren't just clutter. He grabbed his phone, hands unsteady, texting his mother. "Mama, something's off tonight. Heard noises outside. Check Dad's old desk tomorrow, locked drawer. Might be something big." Her reply flashed back. "Lord, Jamal, I heard about threats on the news. Someone's after you. I pried that drawer open an hour ago. Found a drive labeled insurance. It's yours when you're home." He exhaled hard. She'd felt the danger too, and Henry's ghost was rising to meet it. "I stood in the kitchen doorway that night, watching him scribble notes like a man possessed, my heart racing. That thud outside wasn't random. Someone knew he was close, and the news confirmed it with that vague report. It lit a fire in me too. I'd pried open Henry's drawer, my hands shaking as I found that drive, his insurance against a system he'd fought silently. Jamal didn't know it yet, but he was stepping into his father's war. That note, that call, they weren't just threats. They were proof he was right. And as the city slept outside, I prayed he'd find what he needed before they found him. The streetlights on 63rd Street flickered like dying stars as Jamal Carter limped out of Rusty's Diner, the napkin with Sarah Jennings' address tucked deep in his pocket. The night air bit at his face, cold and damp, carrying the faint whine of distant sirens, a Chicago lullaby he'd known since childhood. His crutches clicked against the cracked pavement, steady but slow, each step a reminder of the body that had betrayed him long ago. But his mind was sharp, racing with Tommy's words. Grayson's the kingpin. A judge rigging cases, a lawyer forging documents. This wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was a machine, oiled with money and blood, and Jamal had just kicked it into gear. He replayed the meeting in his head. Tommy's nervous glances, the way his voice dropped when he mentioned Sarah. She was the key, a former IRS clerk who'd seen the gears turn firsthand. If she'd talk, if she'd testify, he could tie Monroe's fake filings to Grayson's orders. But scared witnesses didn't just spill secrets over coffee. He'd have to convince her, and fast. The clock was ticking, 14 days until the Bar Association hearing. Less if whoever left that note decided to stop warning and start acting. That note, with its jagged scrawl, still burned in his memory, and now the news was buzzing with whispers of a lawyer targeted after challenging. A Cook County judge, him? No doubt. A low rumble cut through the quiet. A car engine too close. Jamal turned, squinting into the dark. Headlights flared at the end of the block, a black sedan idling under a busted street lamp. His stomach tightened. He'd seen enough. Cop shows to know a tale when it rolled up, but this wasn't TV. This was real, and he was alone. He picked up his pace, crutches digging into the asphalt, aiming for the alley 2 streets down. South Side instincts kicked in. Lose them in the maze where cars couldn't follow. The sedan crept closer, tires hissing on wet pavement. Jamal ducked into the alley, his breath fogging in the chill. The walls loomed narrow and graffiti-streaked, the ground slick with puddles and trash. He swung his crutches forward, faster now, ignoring the burn in his shoulders. Headlights swept the entrance behind him, then stopped. The car couldn't fit. Footsteps followed instead, heavy and deliberate, splashing through the muck. "Crap," Jamal muttered, scanning the shadows. A rusted fire escape dangled 10 feet ahead, too high to reach. He spotted a dumpster, half open, and made a call. He wedged himself behind it, crutches pressed tight to his chest, the stench of rotting garbage clogging his throat. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. A flashlight beam sliced through the dark, grazing the dumpster's edge. "Carter!" "A voice barked, gruff, unfamiliar. "You can't run forever, kid. Make this easy." Jamal held his breath, heart slamming against his ribs. The beam swung away, but as the footsteps retreated, a scrap of paper fluttered to the ground, caught in the sedan's wake. He waited, counting to 60, then crawled out, suit smeared with grime, snatching it up. Scrawled in black ink. "Last. Warning, Carter, Grayson's watching." The sedan vanished as he peeked around the corner, but the note burned in his hand. This wasn't random. They knew he'd met Tommy, and Grayson's name tied it all together. Back in his apartment, he bolted the door, hands shaking as he sank onto the couch. The note, "Grayson's watching," clenched in his fist. The napkin with Sarah's address, 1427 in Humboldt Ave, quivered as he unfolded it. He needed her testimony, but that name, Grayson, gnawed at him. His father had known. Those locked drawers weren't just clutter. His phone buzzed. His mother's reply glowed bright. "Lord Jamal, I heard about threats on the news. Someone's after you. I pried that drawer open an hour ago, found a drive labeled insurance. It's yours when you're home." He exhaled hard. She'd felt the danger too, and Henry's ghost was rising to meet it. The next evening, he took the L train to Humboldt Park, the address and that note burning holes in his pocket. The neighborhood was a patchwork of sagging row houses and flickering streetlights, quieter than the South Side but just as worn. He found 1427, a faded brick duplex with a crooked mailbox, and knocked, crutches steady under him. The door creaked, open after a long pause, revealing a woman in her 30s, her brown hair pulled into a messy bun, eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "Sarah Jennings?" Jamal asked, keeping his voice soft. "Who are you?" she snapped, clutching the door frame. "Jamal Carter. I'm a lawyer. I know about Monroe and Grayson. I need your help." Her face paled and she started to close the door. "I don't know what you're talking about. Leave." "Wait," Jamal said, leaning forward. "They're framing a man named Marcus Evans, fake tax docs just like they made you process. I've got proof, but I need you to talk. You walked away once. Don't let them keep winning." Sarah froze, her knuckles whitening on the door. "You don't get it," she whispered. "They threatened my kid, said they'd take her if I talked. I can't." Jamal's chest tightened. He'd seen fear like that before. His mother's eyes after the crash, staring at hospital bills they couldn't pay. "I've been scared, too," he said, meeting her gaze. "Lost my legs, my folks, everything. But I'm still here. If we don't fight, they'll take more than your daughter. They'll take everyone's future. I'll protect you, Sarah. I swear it. Last night, Grayson's men chased me because of this." He tapped the note. She stared at him, tears welling, then stepped back. 5 minutes. That's it. Inside, the living room was sparse. Couch, TV, a kid's toy truck on the floor. Sarah sat stiffly, arms crossed. I worked filings for Monroe's clients, she said, voice low. Big companies, millions in hush money. Grayson signed off, said it was court business. When I questioned it, they leaned on me. I quit, but they've got people watching. Jamal pulled out the fake IRS document. This one of yours? She nodded, barely glancing at it. They used old templates. Thought no one would notice. I can't testify, though. They're already after me, Jamal cut in, tapping his crutches. Last night they chased me down an alley. I'm not stopping. If you talk, we can end this. Sarah bit her lip, then whispered, There's a recording. I heard Grayson in some suit on a call, planning to bury a case. I didn't keep it, but... She trailed off, eyes flicking to the window. A recording, Jamal repeated, his pulse racing. That's enough. I'll find it. As he left, promising to call, the weight of her words sank in. Grayson on tape. Proof that could crack the machine wide open. But where? I stood in our attic that morning, prying open Henry's desk drawer with a screwdriver, my hands shaking, as the news droned about a targeted lawyer. Inside was a small USB drive, labeled in his neat scrawl, Insurance. I didn't know what it held, but I knew Jamal needed it. Those threats on the news lit a fire under me. When he came home that night stinking of garbage and resolve, I handed it to him. Your father's fight, I said. Now it's yours. They're coming for you, baby. I heard it on the radio. He nodded, eyes blazing, and I saw it. Henry's, fire burning brighter than ever. They'd hunted him in the dark, but my boy wasn't prey. He was the hunter now. The Cook County courtroom buzzed with restless energy as Jamal Carter stepped through the double doors, the weight of his father's USB drive burning a hole in his pocket. The air was thick with anticipation, a storm brewing behind the polished, oak and stern faces. His crutches clicked against the floor, slower today, not from fatigue but from purpose, each step a calculated move in a chess game he'd been losing until now. The gallery was packed, reporters scribbling, Marcus Evans' family whispering prayers, and Monroe's legal team exchanging smug glances like they'd already carved his tombstone. Judge Harold Grayson loomed behind the bench, his gray eyes narrowing as Jamal approached the defendant's table. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice a low rumble. I hope you've prepared something more substantial than last time. This court won't tolerate fishing expeditions. The jab landed, but Jamal didn't flinch. He'd spent the night listening to the USB, Grayson's voice, clipped and commanding, plotting with some faceless suit. Bury Evans. If that lawyer digs, bury him too. It was a blade, sharp and cold, and Jamal was ready to wield it. Elizabeth Monroe rose, her navy suit crisp, her smile a razor's edge. Your Honor, the defense has no case, she declared, gesturing to a stack of documents. We've proven Mr. Evans' fraud beyond doubt. Bank records, affidavits, IRS filings. Mr. Carter's stalling tactics are a disservice to this court. She shot Jamal a look, daring him to crumble. The jury nodded faintly, swayed by her polish, except for, on the scribbling man in the back, his pen still moving, eyes locked on Jamal. Jamal adjusted his crutches, then pulled a thin folder from his briefcase. His phone buzzed subtly in his pocket. A text from Tommy Ruiz. Dug deeper. Found an email from Monroe to Grayson, dated last year, sent to your inbox. Nail her. A surge of adrenaline sharpened his focus. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady as steel. I move to introduce new evidence under Rule 403, material that directly impacts the prosecution's credibility. He held up the folder. And I request the court summon Sarah Jennings, a former IRS employee with first-hand knowledge of these filings. Grayson's gavel hovered mid-air, his jaw tightening. On what grounds, Mr. Carter? You've already tested my patience with baseless motions. On the grounds that the prosecution's evidence is fraudulent, Jamal shot back, his tone unwavering. This IRS filing, he tapped the folder, bears a seal discontinued in 2015, yet it's dated 2018. Ms. Jennings can confirm it's a forgery, part of a pattern tied to this case. And I've got an email from Ms. Monroe's own files proving her intent. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Monroe's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of panic she quickly masked. "Objection!" she snapped, striding forward. "This is speculative nonsense. He's fabricating discrepancies to confuse the jury." "Then let's hear from Ms. Jennings," Jamal countered, meeting her glare. "If I'm wrong, it'll take 5 minutes to prove it. Unless the prosecution's afraid of what she'll say." Grayson's fingers drummed the bench, his gaze darting to Monroe. The room held its breath. "Objection overruled," he said. Finally, his voice tight. "But this better be relevant, Mr. Carter, or you'll regret it. Clerk, summon the witness." The double doors creaked open 10 minutes later, and Sarah Jennings stepped in. Small, pale, her hands twisting a frayed scarf. She avoided Grayson's stare as she took the stand, her eyes flicking to Jamal like he was her last lifeline. He approached, keeping his voice gentle. "Ms. Jennings, you worked at the IRS until last year, correct?" "Yes," she whispered, barely audible. "Did you process tax filings for Ms. Monroe's clients?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, some of them. They weren't right. Old seals, fake dates. They told me to file them anyway." "Who's they?" Jamal pressed. Sarah's voice trembled. "Ms. Monroe's office. And Judge Grayson signed off on related cases. Said it was court business." The gallery erupted. Gasps, whispers, a reporter's pen snapping in half. Grayson slammed his gavel, face reddening. "Order, Ms. Jennings, you're under oath. Reckless accusations have consequences." "They're not accusations," Jamal cut in, pulling the USB from his pocket. "They're facts. Your Honor, I request permission to play a recording, legally obtained from my late father's files, a former IRS auditor. It corroborates Ms. Jennings' testimony, and with this email from Tommy Ruiz," he held up his phone, "it seals the deal." Monroe leapt up. "Objection. This is inadmissible. He can't authenticate it." "It's authenticated by metadata," Jamal said coolly, handing a printout to the clerk. "Dated emails from my father's IRS account linking to this drive. Rule 901, Your Honor. Sufficient evidence of origin. The emails from Monroe's server, timestamped last year." Grayson's hand froze on the gavel, his eyes boring into Jamal. The clerk passed him the printout, and he scanned it, lips thinning. "Proceed," he growled, the word forced out like it pained him. Jamal plugged the USB into the courtroom's audio system, and Grayson's voice crackled through the speakers. "Evans is a nobody. Bury him with the usual. If that lawyer digs, bury him too. We've got bigger fish." The second voice, smooth and corporate, replied, "Done. Funds are secure." Silence fell, thick and suffocating, as the recording clicked off. The jury sat stunned. Marcus gripped the table, tears welling. Monroe's face drained of color, her fists clenching as she whispered to her team, "We lose this, we lose millions, years of work." Her eyes darted, desperation breaking her polished facade. Grayson slammed his gavel again, but the sound was hollow. "This proves nothing," he barked. "A voice clip. Could be anyone." "Then let the jury decide," Jamal said, turning to them. "That seal's fake. Ms. Jennings saw the orders. This recording ties it to you, Your Honor. If it's nothing, why's the prosecution sweating?" Monroe scrambled, her voice pitching high. "Your Honor, this is a stunt. He's tampering with evidence. We lose this, we lose everything." Jamal held up the printout. "Tampered evidence doesn't come with IRS timestamps. I've got more. Emails from Ms. Monroe's firm to your chambers, ordering filings altered. Want me to read them?" Grayson's gavel hit the bench, harder this time. "Enough. Court's recessed. 30 minutes." He stormed off, robes billowing, leaving chaos in his wake. The gallery exploded, reporters shouting, Marcus's wife sobbing with relief. Sarah sank into her chair, trembling but resolute. Jamal stayed calm, crutches steady, watching Monroe's team huddle in panic. His phone buzzed again. "Tommy, email's in your inbox. Good luck." The scribbling juror stood, slipping a card, to the bailiff before vanishing into the crowd, Jamal caught the gold flash. IRS investigations. His gut twisted. Tommy's ammo. Sarah's truth. And now this. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a war, and he'd just lit the fuse. I sat in the gallery, my hands clasped so tight my nails dug into my palms. I'd seen my boy limp through pain, through loss, through a world that wanted him small. Today, he stood taller than Grayson, taller than Monroe, taller than the system that tried to break him. That USB wasn't just Henry's insurance. It was Jamal's blade, cutting through the lies. And as the room spun around us, I knew they'd underestimated him for the last time. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Judge Harold Grayson's retreating figure, but the chaos he'd unleashed roared louder than any gavel strike. Jamal Carter stood at the defendant's table, his crutches rooted to the floor, the echo of Grayson's recorded voice, "Bury him too," still reverberating in the stunned silence. The gallery was a storm of motion, reporters shouting questions, Marcus Evans' family clutching each other in disbelief, and Elizabeth Monroe's legal team scrambling like rats on a sinking ship. Jamal's heartbeat thumped steady and hard, a drumroll to the collapse he'd just set in motion. Monroe shot up, her composure cracking as she jabbed a finger at him. "This is a farce," she yelled, her voice shrill. "That recording's a fake. He's forged it to sabotage this trial. Your Honor." She spun toward the bench, but Grayson was gone, leaving only the clerk, wide-eyed and frozen. "I demand a mistrial." Jamal didn't blink. "A mistrial won't erase what the jury heard," he said, his tone calm but cutting. He held up the metadata printout, its IRS timestamps glinting under the lights. "Or what Ms. Jennings saw, or what's on these emails." He pulled a second folder from his briefcase, slapping it onto the table. "Correspondence between your firm and Grayson's chambers, ordering fake filings for Marcus Evans. Dated, signed, and logged." The jury leaned forward, eyes wide. Marcus gripped Jamal's arm, whispering, "You got him, man. You got him." Sarah Jennings sat on the witness stand, her scarf twisted into knots, but her chin lifted now, defiance breaking through her. Fear. Monroe's face drained of color, her fists clenching as she turned to her team. "Fix this," she hissed, but the junior attorneys shrank back, flipping through papers with trembling hands. The gallery buzzed louder, phones buzzing, pens scratching, a reporter bolting for the door to file the scoop of the year. Then the double doors swung open again, and Grayson stormed back in, his robes billowing like a thundercloud. His face was a mask of fury, cheeks flushed, eyes blazing. "Order!" he bellowed, slamming his gavel so hard the wood cracked. "Mr. Carter, you're out of line. This court will not be turned into a circus." Jamal met his stare, unflinching. "It's not a circus, Your Honor, it's a reckoning. That recording's real. Your voice, your words. I've got the emails to match. You can't bury this." He tapped the folder, his voice rising just enough to carry. "You told them to bury Marcus. You threatened me. The jury's heard it. The court's heard it. Deny it all you want. Truth's out now." Grayson's gavel hovered, his hand shaking. "You're slandering this bench," he roared, voice cracking with rage. "This court's mine. 30 years I've built it. That tape's inadmissible. Chain of custody's broken." His glare stabbed at Jamal, veins bulging at his temples, a king fighting to hold his crumbling throne. "It's not," Jamal shot back, holding up the USB. "My father, Henry Carter, IRS auditor, logged it in his official capacity. Metadata's verified. Rule 901. You want to challenge it? Call an expert. I'll wait." A gasp rippled through the jury. Monroe lunged forward. "Objection. He's grandstanding. This is tampering." "Overruled," Grayson snapped, but his voice cracked, the first fracture in his armor. He sank back into his chair, rubbing his temple, sweat beading on his forehead. The clerk handed him the email folder, and he flipped through it, his jaw tightening with each page. Then a new voice cut through the din, calm, steady, and unexpected. "Your Honor, if I may." The scribbling juror stood, pulling a badge from his coat pocket. Gold glinted under the lights. IRS Investigations Division. "Special Agent Daniel Pierce. I've been embedded in this trial for 6 months, tracking suspected corruption tied to this bench. Mr. Carter's evidence aligns with our findings. Grayson's been under surveillance. That recording's the last piece we needed. The room went dead silent, then erupted. Grayson's gavel fell from his hand, clattering to the floor. "You'll pay for this, Pierce," he snarled, lunging forward only to be caught by the bailiff. 30 years. Mine. I'll have your badge before this ends." His voice broke as two suited agents flanked him, badges gleaming, their presence a final blow. Monroe staggered back, clutching the table, her eyes darting like a cornered animal's. This is outrageous," she stammered. "A setup." Pierce ignored her, turning to the clerk. "I'm requesting an immediate suspension of proceedings pending a federal investigation. We've got warrants ready." He nodded to Jamal, a flicker of respect in his gaze. "Good work, Carter. You just broke this wide open." Grayson's face turned ashen, his hands clawing the bench as the agents pulled him upright. "No jurisdiction," he barked. But the words were hollow, a dying man's plea drowned by the gallery's roar. The bailiff stepped aside, uncertain, as Grayson was escorted out, his robes dragging, his empire crumbling with each step. Monroe bolted for the exit, but a bailiff blocked her, her protest swallowed by the chaos. Jamal stayed still, letting the storm swirl around him. He glanced at Sarah, who mouthed a shaky, "Thank you," then at Marcus, whose tears streaked his face. "Motion to dismiss all charges against Mr. Evans," Jamal said, his voice ringing clear. "The prosecution's case is built on fraud, proven by their own witness and their own words." Grayson's shadow lingered at the door, but no sound came as Pierce stepped closer. "It's over, Your Honor. Step down." The agents tightened their grip, and Grayson's resistance faded, his head bowing as he was led away. The clerk banged, the gavel voice trembling. "Case dismissed. Charges dropped." Marcus leapt up, pulling Jamal into a bear hug, sobbing, "You did it, man! You did it!" The jury applauded, breaking protocol, their faces alight with awe. Jamal set his crutches aside, standing unaided for the first time in years, not because he could, but because he had to. The weight of the room, the victory, held him up. He turned to the gallery, meeting my eyes, and I saw it, the boy who'd limped through hell, now a man who'd brought it down. "Justice doesn't need legs," he said, loud enough for all to hear. "It needs a heart and a mind that won't quit." I clutched my purse, tears streaming down my face, pride swelling so fierce it hurt. My boy had faced a giant and cut it down, not with muscle, but with the fire Henry gave him, the fire I'd nurtured through every sleepless night. The reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, but Jamal didn't flinch. He'd won, not just for Marcus, but for everyone they'd tried to bury. And as Grayson's shadow faded from that bench, I knew the collapse wasn't just theirs. It was the system's, cracking under the weight of one man's truth. The courtroom emptied like a tide receding, leaving behind a wreckage of scattered papers, stunned whispers, and the faint echo of Marcus Evans' joyful sobs. Jamal Carter stood at the defendant's table, his crutches resting against the chair, untouched for the first time in hours. The air felt lighter now. The oppressive weight of Grayson's gavel lifted, replaced by a quiet that hummed with possibility. His suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, but his shoulders were squared, his brown eyes steady as they met mine across the gallery. My boy, my warrior, had torn down a mountain, and the world was still catching its breath. Marcus clapped him on the back, his voice thick with tears. "You saved me, Jamal. My shop, my family, everything. I don't know how to thank you." His wife, Tanya, rushed from the gallery, throwing her arms around Jamal, her sobs muffled against his shoulder. "God bless you," she whispered over and over, until Marcus pulled her into his own embrace, laughing through the relief. Jamal smiled, a small, tired curve of his lips, but his gaze drifted to the empty bench where Grayson had ruled like a tyrant just moments ago. The reporters swarmed the hallway outside, their shouts a chaotic chorus. "Mr. Carter, how'd you get the recording? What's next for Grayson? Are you suing the court?" Jamal ignored them, slipping past with a murmured, "No comment," his crutches clicking a steady rhythm. I followed close, my heart pounding with a pride so fierce it ached. We stepped into the crisp Chicago afternoon, the wind carrying the bite of autumn and the faint clang of city life. The courthouse steps loomed ahead, a battlefield Jamal had conquered, and for a moment he paused, looking out at the skyline like he could see something bigger on the horizon. The news broke an hour later, splashed across every station, every front page. Judge Harold Grayson suspended amid corruption probe. Attorney Elizabeth Monroe disbarment hearing set. A grainy photo of Grayson, pale and grim, leaving the courthouse in a swarm of agents, ran beside a shot of Jamal, crutches in hand, face calm but resolute. The feds had moved fast. Special Agent Pierce's warrants hit like lightning after the trial, pulling Grayson into custody for questioning by nightfall. Monroe's firm issued a panicked statement, claiming clerical errors. But the damage was done. Her career was ash, and the machine she'd oiled with lies was grinding to a halt. Back home, Jamal sank onto our sagging couch, the USB drive still clutched in his hand. I set a mug of tea beside him, chamomile, his favorite since he was a boy, and sat close, my fingers brushing his arm. "You did it, baby," I said, my voice breaking. "You took him down. Your father, he'd be so proud." Jamal stared at the drive, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. "He knew, Mama," he said softly. "That insurance, he saw this coming years ago. Grayson, Monroe, the whole mess. He left it for me to finish." I nodded, tears blurring my vision. Henry had been a quiet man, but fierce when it mattered, chasing tax cheats through endless audits, locking away secrets he couldn't fight. "So he gave you his fire," I said, "and you lit up that courtroom with it. I've never been prouder, Jamal. Never." He set the drive down, meeting my eyes. "It's not over," he said, his voice firming. "Marcus is free, but how many others aren't? How many got buried because they didn't have a Henry Carter, or a me?" He leaned forward, hands clasped. "I'm starting something. A fund. Legal aid for folks like Marcus, people the system chews up and spits out. I'm gonna make sure they get a voice." My breath caught. "You mean it?" "Dead serious," he said, a spark igniting in his gaze. "Justice isn't just winning a case, it's fixing what's broken. Dad taught me that. You taught me that." I pulled him into a hug, his head resting against my shoulder like when he was small, but he wasn't small anymore. He was a man who'd faced giants and walked away taller. "Then do it," I whispered. "Change it all." The next morning, a letter arrived. Cream stationery, embossed with a law school seal, University of Chicago. I handed it to Jamal as he sipped his coffee, his brow furrowing as he tore it open. His eyes widened, then softened as he read aloud. "Mr. Carter, your recent actions in Cook County Circuit Court have not gone unnoticed. We'd be honored to offer you a guest lectureship, share your insight with our students. Consider it a step toward shaping the future of law." He laughed, a rare, bright sound. "Lecturing? Me? You'd be damn good at it," I said, grinning. "But you're not stopping there, are you?" "Nope," he said, folding the letter. "This is just the start. I'm not here to teach law. I'm here to rewrite it." That afternoon, Marcus stopped by, his face glowing with a peace I hadn't seen before. He handed Jamal a small box, a keychain engraved with "Carter and Evans, Justice Prevails." "Tanya made it," he said, grinning. "Figured you earned it." Jamal turned it over in his hands, a quiet smile breaking through the exhaustion. As Marcus left, I watched Jamal from the kitchen, my boy now a man with a mission. The storm had passed, but the light it left behind wasn't just for us. It was for every soul Grayson's machine had crushed, every voice silenced by power. Jamal had won, not with fists or speed, but with the heart and mind Henry and I had forged in him. And as he scribbled notes for his fund, I knew this victory wasn't an end. It was a dawn. I stood there, my hands trembling with a joy I couldn't name, watching him build something bigger than himself. He'd faced the dark and brought back light, not just for Marcus, not just for us, but for a city, a system, a world that needed it. My Jamal, my unbroken flame. They'd tried to bury him, but he'd buried them instead. And now, with every step he took, crutches or not, He was paving a path for justice to rise again. The late afternoon sun dipped below Chicago's skyline, painting the courthouse steps in shades of gold and shadow as Jamal Carter stood at their base, his crutches catching the light. The chaos of yesterday had settled into a hum. Reporters still lingered, their cameras flashing like fireflies, but their shouts had dulled to a murmur. Jamal pulled his hoodie over his head, not out of fear, but because the spotlight wasn't what he'd fought for. Beside me, his mother. I held his arm, my worn coat flapping in the wind, my eyes tracing the face of a boy who'd become a man in a single seismic week. The city buzzed with his name now. Jamal Carter, the crippled genius who toppled a judge. Headlines screaming from every newsstand. Grayson's suspension had mushroomed into a full-blown federal probe, with indictments looming like storm clouds. Monroe's disbarment hearing was set for next month, her firm crumbling under lawsuits from former clients. Marcus Evans was back, at his auto shop, hammering dents with a grin. His family safe because of Jamal. But my boy didn't bask in it. He stood there, quiet, his gaze fixed on the horizon, like he was already mapping the next fight. A voice broke the stillness. Steady, authoritative, as Special Agent Daniel Pierce crossed the street from his unmarked sedan, hands in his pockets. "Mr. Carter," he said, nodding. "Heard about your plans. We're digging into Grayson's network. Could use a consultant with your eye. Part-time, off the books. Your work sparked a restitution review. Might fund your initiative. Think it over." Jamal took the card, flipping it between his fingers. "I don't just want to consult, Pierce. I want to change it, root it out so it can't grow back. This," he pulled a folded paper from his pocket, a rough draft scribbled in the margins. "Carter Justice Initiative, for the buried. This is step 1. Free legal aid for folks like Marcus, people the system forgets. I'm meeting a nonprofit lawyer tomorrow to launch it." My chest swelled, tears pricking my eyes. "You're really doing it?" "Gotta," he said, his voice steady. "Grayson's gone, but the machine's still there. I'm not letting it grind anyone else down. Not if I can help it." A shout cut through the air. "Mr. Carter." "One question." A young reporter, barely 20, darted forward, recorder in hand. Jamal sighed but nodded. "Make it quick." "How's it feel to beat Grayson?" she asked, breathless. Jamal glanced at me, then back at her. "It's not about beating him. It's about digging out the truth. For Marcus, for everyone he hurt. That's what matters." He waved her off, turning away as she scribbled furiously. I squeezed his arm, grinning. "Your dad would have been so proud, baby. He fought those shadows too." Jamal chuckled, low and warm. "He gave me the tools, Mama. But I'm building something new, rewriting the rules with this fund." We started down the steps, slow and deliberate. "What's next?" I asked, though I knew his heart was already racing ahead. He paused, looking out at the city, its towers, its scars, its heartbeat. "Next I build," he said. "The fund, with IRS backing, whatever it takes. Dad left me his fight, but I'm making it mine. One case, one voice at a time." He smiled, brighter, this time. "You with me, Mama?" "Always," I said, my voice catching. "Always." We reached the curb, and he slid into the passenger seat of our old Honda, me behind the wheel. The keychain Marcus had given him, Carter and Evans, Justice Prevails, dangled from the ignition, glinting as I turned the key. The engine sputtered, to life. And we pulled away, the courthouse shrinking in the rear view. That night, back home, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, the IRS letter beside his fund draft, his pen moving steadily. I leaned against the counter, watching him sketch the future, plans for legal aid, notes from Pierce's offer, a blueprint for justice. My boy, no, my man, hadn't just cracked a case. He'd shattered a wall, and now he was rebuilding it, brick by brick, for every soul the system had crushed. Henry's fire burned in him, but it was Jamal's soul that made it soar, a soul that wouldn't rest until the buried could rise. I dried my hands and joined him, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You're rewriting it all, Jamal," I said, voice thick with pride. Not just for us, for every voice they silenced. He looked up, eyes glistening but fierce. For them, Mama. For us all. This fund's my promise. They won't be forgotten again. As the city hummed outside, I saw it clearly. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the dawn of a road he'd carve, not just for himself, but for every soul who'd been told they didn't matter. My Jamal, the boy who'd limped through shadows, was now the man lighting the way, a torchbearer for justice, unyielding and unbroken, and God help anyone who dared to dim that flame. So what hit you hardest about Jamal's journey? Was it that moment he turned the tables in court, or the way he's lighting a path for others now? Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you fight for if the system came for you? If you're loving these real-life battles for justice, don't miss out. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you're in on every story we uncover next. And hey, thanks for sticking with me to the end. You're the reason these tales keep coming alive. See you in the next one.